They were outcasts, unwanted, forgotten by the world. 10 men, marked by disease, forced to live in the shadows of society. For years, they had known nothing but pain, rejection, and hopelessness. Until one day, everything changed. A man was passing by, not just any man, Jesus of Nazareth, and with trembling voices they cried out, "Lepers!" Desperate, calling out, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." What happened next was a miracle, but the real question is, what would they do with it? Would they return to their old lives, or recognize the one who had given them a new one? One man made a choice that changed everything, and his story is about to begin. The wind carried the scent of dust and dry earth as the sun hung low over the hills of Samaria and Galilee. The narrow paths winding through the landscape were often traveled by merchants, Roman soldiers, and weary travelers making their way to Jerusalem. Along these roads, life moved with an unrelenting rhythm, but for some, time stood still, frozen in suffering, waiting for the impossible. A group of men, hidden from the bustling roads and distant city gates, stood at the edges of society. Their bodies were wrapped in torn cloth, their faces marked with scars that spoke of pain and rejection. They were lepers, outcasts driven away from their homes, families, and the warmth of human embrace. They were condemned to live in the wilderness, in abandoned caves and makeshift shelters, bound together only by the fate they shared. Among them was Malchiah, a former merchant whose once prosperous trade routes stretched from Jericho to Jerusalem. His hands, which once counted silver coins and fine fabrics, were now covered in white patches of disease. Then there was Reuben, a father of 3, whose greatest sorrow was not his illness, but the longing to hold his children again. He remembered their laughter, the way they would run to him when he returned home, and how they once clung to his robe. Now they could only watch him from a distance, fear and sorrow in their eyes. At the edge of the group stood Eliab, a young man barely in his 20s, whose dreams of marriage and a family had been stolen the day he noticed the first signs of his affliction. And then there was Jonas, a Samaritan, the only one among them not of Jewish descent. The rest of the men had grown up in the temple, raised under the law of Moses, but Jonas was an outsider twice over. To the world, he was unclean both in body and bloodline. Each man carried his own grief, his own story of loss, and his own silent prayers for mercy. In ancient times, leprosy was more than a disease, it was a curse. The law of Moses, as recorded in the book of Leviticus, declared lepers ritually unclean. Those afflicted were not only sick, they were cast out from society, seen as objects of divine punishment. No one dared touch them, lest they too be contaminated. "Unclean, unclean." This was the cry they were required to shout if anyone approached them. It was a constant reminder of their shame, their separation, and their hopelessness. Their voices, once filled with joy and purpose, had been reduced to warnings of rejection. They lived in colonies, far from the cities and towns. Some relied on the kindness of family members who would leave food at a safe distance. Others survived by begging from travelers who dared to pass near their desolate camps. The nights were cold, the days scorching, and hope was a distant memory. Among them, there were different attitudes toward their fate. Some had resigned themselves to death, their spirits broken. Others clung to rumors of miracles, speaking in hushed tones about a man from Nazareth, a healer who performed wonders. They say he gives sight to the blind. They say he made a paralyzed man walk. Some call him the Son of David. Some say he is a prophet. Others say he is more. Jesus. It was a name carried on the wind, spoken in secret by those who still dared to hope. Some of the lepers had heard of him before, but how could they believe? How could they, the most forsaken of all, expect mercy from such a man? Yet as they huddled together that night beneath the stars, the whispers of faith grew louder than their doubts. And then the news came. He is coming. The morning was still young when the lepers gathered at their usual place, a rocky clearing just outside a small village along the road leading to Jerusalem. The village was a place of passage, where travelers stopped to rest before continuing their journey. This was their chance. As the sun climbed higher, the distant shuffling of footsteps reached their ears. A group was approaching, the voices of men and women speaking in excited tones. The lepers strained their ears, their hearts pounding. Was it truly him? Then they saw him, Jesus of Nazareth, walking with his disciples, moving with a presence that was both humble and commanding. The crowd surrounded him, eager to hear his words. He was dressed simply, his robe worn from travel, yet his face bore a peace that no earthly suffering could touch. The lepers knew this was their moment. Fear clashed with faith as they struggled to find their voices. Some hesitated, ashamed of their condition. Others feared rejection. But then Malchiah stepped forward, his voice hoarse but desperate. "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us!" His cry broke through the air, raw and pleading. The others followed, their voices rising together in desperation. "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." The crowd gasped. People turned in shock at the sound of lepers calling out to the teacher. Some backed away, covering their faces with their robes, afraid of contamination. Others whispered, watching to see what Jesus would do. Would he turn away? Would he scold them for daring to speak? Would he, like so many others, pretend they did not exist? No. Jesus stopped. He turned toward them, his eyes filled with something they had never seen before, compassion. A hush fell over the crowd. The air was thick with anticipation. The lepers stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Then Jesus spoke. "Go, show yourselves to the priests." The words hung in the air. The lepers exchanged confused glances. The priests, but why? The priests were the ones who examined a healed leper and declared them clean, but they were still sick. Their bodies were still covered in sores. Their hands still bore the marks of their suffering. For a moment doubt crept in, but something in Jesus' voice, something undeniable, stirred within them. Faith. It was a choice, a moment of decision. One by one they turned, one step, then another. And as they walked in obedience, something miraculous happened. The lepers stood frozen, staring at Jesus. His command had been simple, yet baffling. "Go, show yourselves to the priests." For a leper, seeing a priest meant one thing: verification of healing. Only the priests had the authority to declare a person clean, allowing them to re-enter society, to return to their homes, their families. But standing there, their skin was still marked with disease. Their bodies still bore the wounds of their suffering. Why would he send them now? Doubt flickered in their eyes. "Did he even hear us?" Reuben whispered. "Why go to the priests when we are still sick?" Malchiah muttered. "What if he is testing us?" another asked. But Jonas, the Samaritan, stepped forward. His gaze never left Jesus, and for the first time in years he felt something stir inside him. Hope. If he tells us to go, we must go. His voice was steady. The others hesitated, but Jonas took the first step, one step forward, then another. The rest of the lepers exchanged uncertain glances before following behind him. One by one they chose to obey. As they walked away from Jesus, they could still feel the sting of their disease. Their fingers were numb. Their feet ached from years of wounds that had not healed. The road ahead was uneven, dust rising with every step. At first they walked slowly, hesitantly, stealing glances at their bodies. Would they see a difference? Would healing come? The journey to the priests in the temple was long, perhaps too long if they remained in this condition. They risked ridicule, even being driven away. But something pushed them forward, an unseen force urging them to trust the words of Jesus. The first mile passed. Nothing changed. The second mile, still the same. The doubts returned, clawing at their faith. "Maybe this was all for nothing," Eliab muttered, glancing at his still wounded hands. "I don't want to be humiliated at the temple," Malchiah groaned. "We should turn back. Maybe we misunderstood him." But Jonas pressed on. He could feel something deep inside him, something shifting, stirring, awakening. And then it happened. It was subtle at first. Jonas felt warmth spread through his body, like fire coursing through his veins. The aches in his joints, the numbness in his fingers, it began to fade. Then one of the others stumbled, gasping. "My hands! Look at my hands!" Jonas turned and saw Malchiah holding up his arms. His diseased skin was gone. Where there had been open sores, there was now smooth, healthy flesh. "I feel strong again," Reuben shouted. He stretched his arms, something he hadn't been able to do in years. The others looked down at themselves. The white patches of disease disappeared. The swollen fingers restored. The scars healed. One by one, their sickness vanished as if it had never been there. Their cries of joy and amazement echoed across the empty road. They touched their faces, their arms, their hands. It was real. "We are healed. We are clean." Some of them fell to the ground, overwhelmed by the miracle. Others laughed. Some wept. Some raised their hands in praise. For the first time in years, they felt whole again. The group did not hesitate. Their feet moved swiftly now, running toward the temple. "We must show the priests," Malchiah shouted. "Once they declare us clean, we can return home." The thought of their families, their old lives, their futures, it drove them forward. Reuben imagined the faces of his children. They would no longer be afraid to come near him. He could hold them, laugh with them, tell them stories at night. Eliab thought of his parents, who had last seen him as a broken man. Now he would return to them strong and renewed. Malchiah thought of his business, his wealth, all he had lost. Now he could reclaim it. The 9 lepers hurried down the road, hearts pounding with excitement, thoughts fixed on what came next. None of them looked back. None of them stopped. None of them thought to return to Jesus. But one man did stop. Jonas, the Samaritan. As he ran alongside the others, something tugged at his heart. He slowed his steps. Then he stopped. He turned. The others barely noticed as they continued running ahead. Jonas stood still, his breath heavy, his mind racing. He was healed. He was free. But was that the most important thing? Was the healing greater than the one who gave it? His heart ached, not with sorrow but with realization. This was not just a miracle. This was an encounter with God. Jonas turned his gaze back toward the road behind him, back toward Jesus, and then he ran, not toward the temple, not toward the priests, but back to the one who had healed him. The dust kicked up beneath Jonas's feet as he raced back. His lungs burned, but he didn't care. Tears streamed down his face, not from sorrow, but from gratitude. As he approached Jesus, he did not stop to catch his breath. He did not hesitate or slow down. He threw himself at Jesus' feet. "Thank you, Lord," he cried. His voice broke, choked with emotion. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." His hands clutched the ground near Jesus' sandals. Tears fell freely. For the first time in years, he felt whole, not just in body, but in soul. Jesus looked down at him. His expression was not surprised, nor amused. Instead, there was something deep in his eyes, a mixture of joy and sorrow. Jesus gently touched Jonas's shoulder, then looked around. His voice was calm yet heavy with meaning. "Were not 10 cleansed?" A pause. "Where are the other 9? The crowd was silent. Jesus looked back down at Jonas, the Samaritan, the outcast, the one no one would have expected to return. Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? Jonas lifted his head, his eyes meeting the eyes of the Son of God. Jesus smiled. And then he spoke words that would remain with Jonas forever. "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." This was more than just physical healing. This was a healing of the soul. Jonah stood, his heart full, his spirit lifted, and as he walked away from Jesus, he knew something the other 9 never would. Healing was a gift, but gratitude was the greatest blessing of all. The 9 former lepers ran as fast as their feet could carry them, hearts pounding in their chests. The temple was still far away, but nothing could slow them down now, not hunger, not fatigue, and certainly not the memory of their years of suffering. For the first time in so long they were free. As they ran, Malchiah turned to Reuben, his face alight with excitement. "Can you believe this? We're actually clean." Reuben grinned, breathless. "It's like a dream. The priests will see us, declare us clean, and we'll have our lives back." Behind them, Eliab let out a joyful shout, throwing his arms up in triumph. "No more hiding, no more begging. We can finally go home." They all laughed, their voices full of relief and happiness. But in their rush to reclaim their old lives, none of them noticed that Jonas was no longer with them. The gates of the city loomed ahead, the grand temple standing tall beyond them. The priests would be there, waiting to inspect anyone who claimed healing. The 9 men slowed as they approached, their excitement barely contained. But then reality struck. Though their bodies were healed, they were still dressed in the rags of outcasts. Their faces were unfamiliar to the city guards. They had no proof of who they once were, and worse, no one trusted a former leper. A guard stepped forward, his expression wary. "What business do you have here?" Malchiah, still breathless from the run, lifted his hands. "We have been healed. We were lepers, but now we are clean. The priest must see us and declare us whole." The guard's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicked over their ragged clothing, his lips curling in doubt. "Healed? By whom?" The men hesitated. They had seen the miracle with their own eyes, yet now faced with questioning, something in them wavered. "A teacher, a prophet," Eliab muttered. "Jesus of Nazareth," Reuben added quickly. The guard's face hardened at the name. That troublemaker? The one stirring up the people? A murmur passed between the other guards. "Do not speak of him here." The 9 men looked at each other uneasily. They had been healed by Jesus, but was it safe to admit it? Before they could answer, a priest emerged from the temple gates, his long robes flowing as he stepped toward them. "What is this commotion?" Malchiah stepped forward again. "Rabbi, we have been healed of leprosy. Please examine us and declare us clean." The priest narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. He reached out, touching Malchiah's arm, something unthinkable for a leper. But the priest's eyes widened in shock as he felt smooth, unblemished skin. "It is true," he murmured. One by one, he inspected each of the men, and one by one, he found no trace of disease. Finally, he stepped back. "You are clean." The words fell like music upon their ears. A collective cheer erupted from the men. They clutched one another, laughing, some with tears of joy streaming down their faces. "You may return to your homes," the priest continued. "But first, you must bring your offering of cleansing as Moses commanded." The men nodded eagerly. They would do anything now, anything to reclaim their place in society. But as they prepared to leave the temple, something unspoken lingered between them. None of them had gone back to Jesus. None of them had thanked him. The celebration continued as the men entered the city streets, walking among the crowds for the first time in years. But as the excitement settled, an uneasy thought crept into Reuben's mind. Why didn't we go back? They had been so quick to run to the temple, to seek the approval of the priests. But what about the man who had actually healed them? He turned to Malchiah, lowering his voice. "Do you think we should have returned to Jesus?" Malchiah sighed, shaking his head. "We were following the law, Reuben. The law says we must be declared clean by the priests. We did what was right. But wasn't Jesus the one who healed us?" Malchiah hesitated. "Yes, but he told us to go to the priests. We obeyed." Eliab, overhearing the conversation, joined in. Besides, what could we have done? Fallen at his feet? Thanked him? He shrugged. He doesn't need our thanks. He's a teacher, a prophet. He knew we were grateful. Reuben wanted to argue, but something in their tone troubled him. Was it true? Did Jesus expect their gratitude? Or had they simply been too eager for their own blessing to stop and give thanks? And then a new thought gripped him. Where is the Samaritan? While the 9 men rejoiced in the temple, one man had returned to Jesus. Jonas, the foreigner, the outsider, the one they least expected to be grateful. He was the only one who had fallen at Jesus' feet. He had recognized what the others had overlooked. Healing was a gift, but true faith was more than just receiving. It was returning to give thanks. Jonas had walked away from the temple, away from the priests, away from the approval of men. He had chosen to go back to the source of his healing, and because of that, Jesus had spoken a greater truth over him. Rise and go. Your faith has made you well, not just healed, well, whole. The 9 men had received physical healing, but Jonas had received something far greater, a restored soul. Days passed, and the 9 men returned to their homes, their families, their old lives. They were no longer outcasts. They were welcomed back into society, reclaimed their former identities, and moved on. But for Reuben, a quiet unease remained. At night, as he lay in his old bed, surrounded by the comforts of home, a single thought haunted him. We should have gone back. He had seen the miracle, had been given a second chance at life, but had failed to acknowledge the one who gave it. And now it was too late. Jesus had moved on. The chance to return, to kneel before him in gratitude, was gone. And so, even though his body was healed, a deep part of him felt empty. He had received his blessing, but he had missed the greater gift. Jonas stood before Jesus, his body healed, his soul overwhelmed. The dust from the road clung to his clothes, but he no longer cared. He had fallen at Jesus' feet, pouring out his gratitude in tears and worship. The words of Jesus still echoed in his mind. Rise and go. Your faith has made you well, not just healed, well, whole, restored. Jonas rose to his feet slowly, his heart still racing from the encounter. The crowd around Jesus whispered, some in awe, others confused. Why did only one return? Someone murmured. And a Samaritan of all people? Another scoffed. Jonas knew that to many he was still an outsider. Even among those who followed Jesus, there were some who saw him as less than, a foreigner undeserving of such a miracle. But Jesus had looked at him differently. Jesus had seen more than just a leper in need of healing. He had seen a heart of faith, and that made all the difference. As Jonas turned to leave, he felt lighter than ever before. The burden of his disease had been lifted, but more than that, so had the weight of his rejection, his shame, his unworthiness. The road stretched out before him, leading back to where he had once been an outcast. But he knew he would never be the same again. As he walked, he thought about the others. The 9 who had rushed ahead to the temple, eager to receive their place in society again. Had they even thought about returning? Did they understand what had happened to them? Jonas wasn't sure, but he knew this. The miracle wasn't just in the healing, it was in recognizing the one who gave it. Jonas didn't return to the Samaritan villages that day. Instead, he followed from a distance as Jesus and his disciples continued their journey toward Jerusalem. He listened as Jesus taught, heard him speak of a kingdom greater than Rome, of a love deeper than the law, of a faith that could move mountains. And for the first time, Jonas understood. This wasn't just about miracles. It was about relationship. It was about knowing the heart of God. It was about gratitude, not just for what was given, but for the one who gives. Meanwhile, in the city, far away, the 9 other former lepers lived their new lives. They returned to their families, embraced loved ones who had long abandoned them. They were welcomed back into their homes, their businesses, their synagogues. They were no longer outcasts. They had everything they had once longed for. And yet, as the days passed, something felt missing. Reuben sat by the fire in his home, his children laughing in the next room. The warmth of home surrounded him, but his heart felt cold. Why didn't I go back? He thought about that moment on the road when their bodies had been restored. He had felt the miracle, witnessed it, been a part of it. And yet, when he had the chance to return, he had chosen the temple instead. Did I seek the gift more than the giver? As Jonas continued to travel with the crowd, he noticed that Jesus spoke more about faith than miracles. One day a disciple asked him, "Lord, increase our faith." Jesus responded, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." Matthew 17:20, Jonas realized something profound. The miracle wasn't just about physical healing. It was about the faith that led to gratitude. And gratitude, true gratitude, leads to transformation. As Jonas sat by the fire that night, watching the stars above, he whispered a prayer. "Thank you, Lord, not just for my healing, but for opening my eyes." For the 9, the miracle had been the end of their suffering. For Jonas, it was the beginning of something greater. And as he looked ahead, he knew he would never be the same again. Jonas sat among the crowd as Jesus continued his journey toward Jerusalem. He had once been an outcast, a leper, a man without a future. But now, everything was different. For the first time in years, he wasn't just existing, he was truly living. And more than that, he had a purpose. Jonas had left his old life behind, not just because of his healing, but because he had found something greater than healing. He had found faith, and that faith was leading him to something more. It wasn't easy to follow Jesus. The roads were long, the journey tiring, and not everyone welcomed them. Some people mocked Jesus, calling him a troublemaker. Others followed only for the miracles, hoping for healing or a sign. But Jonas saw something different in Jesus. He saw compassion. He saw power. He saw truth. Every word Jesus spoke moved him. Every story, every parable, every act of kindness, it all spoke to something deep inside Jonas's soul. This wasn't just a man. This was the Son of God. And Jonas knew he could never turn back. One evening, as they rested near a small village, Jonas found himself sitting near the disciples, listening as Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God. "The greatest among you must be a servant," Jesus said. Jonas thought about his past, about how people had avoided him, how they had feared his disease. He had been an outcast, forced to beg for food, to survive in the shadows. Now Jesus was saying that greatness wasn't about power or position, it was about serving others. "But Lord," one of the disciples asked, "how do we know who belongs in your kingdom?" Jesus smiled and told a parable. A man was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They beat him, stole his possessions, and left him for dead. A priest walked by and saw him, but he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. Then a Levite came, but he also ignored the wounded man. Finally, a Samaritan saw him, had compassion, and took care of him. He bandaged his wounds, placed him on his own donkey, and took him to an inn. He even paid for the man's stay until he was well. Jesus then asked, "Which of these 3 was a neighbor to the wounded man?" The disciples answered, "The one who showed mercy." Jesus nodded. "Go and do likewise." Jonas felt his heart tremble. A Samaritan. He was a Samaritan, and in Jesus' story, it wasn't the religious leaders or the men of status who were the heroes. It was the one the world looked down on. Jonas realized something incredible. Jesus wasn't just healing bodies, he was restoring hearts. The next day, Jonas found himself walking beside Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples. Peter had seen miracles, walked on water, even spoken directly to Jesus about the things to come. But despite everything, Jonas sensed that Peter still struggled with understanding the depth of Jesus' mission. "You're a Samaritan, aren't you?" Peter asked, looking at Jonas curiously. Jonas nodded. "And yet you came back to thank him," Peter said, shaking his head, while the other 9 did not. Jonas thought for a moment. "I realized something that day," he finally said. "I wanted healing, but what I needed was Jesus." Peter was silent for a moment. Then he smiled. "You understand more than most of us." Jonas laughed, shaking his head. "I just know that when you've been saved, you don't run away from the one who saved you." Peter patted Jonas on the shoulder, his respect for the Samaritan growing. Jesus had spoken often about faith, but Jonas had lived it. As the journey continued, Jonas became known among the followers of Jesus. He wasn't a preacher, he wasn't a teacher, but he had a story. And when people asked him why he followed Jesus, he always answered the same way. "Because he didn't just heal me, he made me whole." He spoke to other outcasts, the rejected, the forgotten. He told them about how he had once been abandoned, how he had once been a man without hope. And he told them about the day he met Jesus of Nazareth, the one who had not only healed his body, but had transformed his soul. "He doesn't just restore what was lost," Jonas would say. "He gives you something better." And people listened, because when someone speaks from a grateful heart, others can't help but hear the truth. Jonas continued to follow Jesus, witnessing even greater miracles. He saw the blind receive sight, the lame walk, the dead rise. And yet, the greatest miracle he ever experienced was the one that happened in his own heart. Because gratitude had led him to faith, and faith had led him to Jesus. One day, long after Jesus had risen and the disciples had spread his message, Jonas sat by a quiet river, reflecting on the life he had lived. So many years had passed since that day when he'd been one of the 10 lepers. 9 had gone to the temple, 1 had returned, and that 1 had been him. "Thank you, Lord," Jonas whispered, "for choosing me, for opening my eyes, for making me whole." A gentle wind rustled the trees, and Jonas smiled, because he knew his gratitude had led him to the greatest gift of all. 10 men were healed, but only 1 was made whole. 9 received their miracle and rushed back to their old lives. 1 returned to the giver of the miracle. He fell at Jesus' feet, not just to receive, but to give back his gratitude, his worship, his heart. And in return, Jesus gave him something greater than healing: salvation, transformation, a new life. So the question remains, would you be one of the 9, or would you be the 1? The greatest miracle isn't just in what you receive, it's in knowing the one who gave it. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. 1 Thessalonians. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful Bible stories.